It's the 1960s, and London's rock scene is alive with raw energy, chaos, and endless rivalry. The Rolling Stones are rising, capturing hearts and stirring controversy with their rebellious image and unmistakable sound. But behind the hits and the headlines, there's a darker side to their story, a world where feuds, both within and outside the band, run deep. And no one knows this side better than Pete Townshend, guitarist and creative force of The who has often stood toe-to-toe with the Stones. In a candid moment, Townshend pulls back the curtain on why he thinks everybody hates the Rolling Stones, revealing a world of unresolved conflicts, bruised egos, and fierce competition. Think of it, London in the early 60s, a musical melting pot where The Who and the Rolling Stones were young, wild, and unpolished. Townshend recalls those days vividly. They were different from the Beatles, he says. The Beatles wanted to bring people together. The Stones? They wanted to tear it all down. For Townshend, the Stones represented the darker side of rock and roll, a band that seemed more interested in breaking the rules than in making music that resonated universally. The tension between the two bands simmered right from the start. Both The Who and the Rolling Stones wanted to dominate the scene, but where The Who brought a powerful, polished aggression, the Stones thrived on raw, unfiltered energy. Their clashes were as much about music as they were about personalities. Townshend describes Mick Jagger as charming but ruthless, a frontman who'd do anything to stay on top. And as the Stones' fame grew, their confidence and arrogance only intensified. It was the kind of ambition that drew admiration and resentment in equal measure. As the 70s took hold, the rivalry between The Who and the Rolling Stones reached new heights. Townshend and his bandmates were no strangers to conflict, but their clashes with the Stones went beyond mere competition. There was always this feeling that we had to prove ourselves against them, Townshend admits. The Who was known for its innovation, its explosive energy, and its trailblazing sound, but in the eyes of the public, the Stones were always one step ahead, largely thanks to their relentless self-promotion and knack for controversy. This didn't sit well with Townshend. He felt that while The Who was pushing the boundaries of rock, creating concept albums like Tommy and Quadrophenia, the Stones were getting by on image and sensationalism. He saw their infamous arrests, their drug-fueled antics, and their tabloid exploits as distractions from what rock music could and should be. They sold the bad boy image hard, he says, but at what cost? Their music became less about the art and more about the scandal. Townshend's frustration with the Stones' ability to captivate audiences with drama rather than innovation became a deep-seated resentment. But the conflicts that surrounded the Rolling Stones weren't just with other bands. They cut deeply through the band itself, like cracks forming in a brittle surface. Pete Townshend observed this, sometimes with fascination, often with disbelief. He knew that tension could spark creativity, but for the Stones, that tension was volatile, teetering on the edge of implosion. The heart of their struggles was a rivalry between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, a relationship that defined and nearly destroyed them. It was always Mick's band, Townshend says with certainty. Keith knew it, and it drove him mad. That friction was both their magic and their curse. The friendship between Jagger and Richards was as complex as the music they created. Richards, the ultimate rock and roll purist, saw himself as the soul of the Stones, a fierce defender of rock's wild heart. Jagger, however, was the strategist, the businessman who understood the machine of fame. While Richards wanted authenticity, Jagger knew that success demanded reinvention. Their differences ignited both incredible songs and bitter resentment, and Townshend, from his place on the sidelines, could see how this divide fueled but also weakened them. They fed off their own conflicts, he remarks, a hint of disdain in his voice. That kind of turmoil can burn you out. To Townshend, the very idea of internal discord was anathema. He believed bands should be unified, moving forward with a shared vision. The Who had its own issues, of course, but they were bound together by a sense of purpose. The Stones, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on discord. It was as if they needed the chaos to stay relevant, as if their art depended on the edge that only anger and rebellion could provide. Townshend observed this dynamic with a mix of admiration and frustration, convinced that the band's constant struggle was both their greatest asset and their inevitable downfall. Stories of near breakups and explosive arguments became legendary in the Stones' history. Townshend recalls how, in 1973, Richards stormed out of a studio session, leaving Jagger and the rest of the band scrambling to complete an album. Jagger, who was always looking forward, often clashed with Richards, whose loyalty lay with the past and with the raw rock energy that the band had built its name on. Keith wanted rock to stay rebellious, Townshend recalls. He wanted to be that defiant voice, while Mick was happy to compromise for fame. This ideological clash made for brilliant music, but it also led to endless power struggles. The conflict wasn't just about music, it was about control. Jagger, ever the frontman, was the face of the Stones, the one who charmed audiences and kept them coming back. Richards, however, felt the heart of the band was his to protect. Townshend could see how the rivalry played out in subtle ways. Jagger would push the band toward commercial success, while Richards would sabotage those efforts by leaning into rock's darker side, testing the limits of their partnership. They were always at odds, Townshend says. Jagger's ambition clashed with Richards' rebellion, and neither of them was willing to back down. For Townshend, the tensions within the Stones represented the very chaos he despised. He understood the allure of being the rebellious underdogs, but he believed that the Stones had taken it too far, letting their internal conflicts drive them instead of the music itself. It's one thing to challenge each other creatively, he reflects, but they made it personal. That kind of battle, it takes a toll, it drains the energy, it consumes you. He saw their struggles as a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how talented a band might be, the weight of unchecked egos and unresolved grudges could fracture even the strongest foundations. One of the most contentious periods between Pete Townshend and the Rolling Stones came in the late 1970s, when the Stones embarked on their infamous Some Girls tour. For audiences, it was the epitome of rock and roll decadence, a riot of excess, glamorous parties, and uninhibited freedom. But for Townshend, who watched from the sidelines with a mix of disbelief and disappointment, it marked a sharp turn in the band's journey. They stopped caring about the music, he would later say, bluntly. It was all about the show, the headlines, the outrageous stunts. To Townshend, the Some Girls tour was a sad testament to the Stones' shift in priorities, a shift that had turned artistry into theater. Townshend saw it as the point where the Stones had crossed into self-parody. For him, the Mick Jagger who once electrified audiences with his authentic swagger had become a performer trapped by his own legend. The stage was no longer a space of raw expression but a predictable spectacle, and the songs that once pushed boundaries had turned into a greatest hits routine. As Townshend scoffs, they were playing the same hits, telling the same story over and over. And the worst part, people still bought it. They still cheered for it. To him, the Stones were cashing in on nostalgia, feeding audiences what they wanted rather than challenging them with something new. The tour's decadence mirrored the headlines. Jagger and Richards splashed across tabloids for antics that seemed more sensational than genuine. From bar brawls to infamous backstage parties, the Some Girls tour became a circus. Townshend remembers reading about their exploits in disbelief. It was like they were trying to live up to their own myth, as if they'd forgotten who they were beneath it all. In Townshend's eyes, the tour wasn't a celebration of music but of image, a showcase of the Stones' commitment to staying in the spotlight at all costs. He found himself unable to reconcile the band he had once respected with the band that now seemed trapped in a never-ending loop of excess and self-promotion. While The Who was exploring complex themes, releasing ambitious albums like Quadrophenia and tackling questions of identity and society, the Rolling Stones seemed stuck in place. To Townshend, his own band was evolving, growing up alongside their fans, pushing both themselves and their audience to think. The Stones, by contrast, seemed content to revel in their mythology. They had the power to be more, he says, frustration evident in his tone. Instead, they chose to just keep on playing the same old game, like they were afraid to lose the crowd if they gave them anything real. For Townshend, the Stones had stopped being the band he could respect. The more he watched, the more disillusioned he became, feeling that the Stones were feeding off a legacy rather than contributing anything meaningful to rock and roll. They had, in his eyes, become part of the system they once rebelled against, performing as rock and roll's eternal outlaws while sticking to the safest, most predictable path possible. So why, according to Townshend, does everybody hate the Rolling Stones? To him, it's not about the music, it's about the attitude. They were willing to play the villain, he says, almost shaking his head in disbelief. They made a career out of being hated, of being the bad boys of rock. Maybe that's why they survived, but it's also why they've lost respect for Townshend. The Stones became a caricature of themselves, villains in the story they had crafted. The rebel image they had once flirted with in the 60s became a lifelong commitment, one that felt more like a cage than a choice as the years went on. Yet for a band that thrived on breaking rules, Townshend wonders if they ever found themselves trapped by their own myth. Once they chose that path, there was no turning back, and it seemed they had to live up to that image at every turn. Mick, Keith, they'd play the roles, but it's as if they forgot who they were underneath all that. They leaned into the chaos, they embraced the controversy, and somewhere along the way they let the fame define them. His voice takes on a tinge of sadness, the kind that only comes from watching legends chase shadows of themselves, trying to be what the world expects. They had everything: the talent, the charisma, the platform to make a difference. But instead of using it to grow, they just doubled down on the attitude. Townshend's tone softens as he considers the cost of that choice. For him, the tragedy of the Rolling Stones isn't their antics or their controversies. It's what they sacrificed to become rock's eternal rebels. They traded evolution for fame, substance for spectacle. He believes that, in the end, their decision to become the Rolling Stones meant turning away from deeper artistry. "I can't hate them," he admits, "but I can't admire them either." They chose a path, and it worked, but it came with a cost. For Townshend, the Rolling Stones are a cautionary tale, a band that had the world at their feet but chose to embrace their own myth at the expense of everything else. Their image, their legacy, their fame, it's undeniable, but it came with a price. They're legends, no doubt about that, he acknowledges. But sometimes, being a legend means being hated too.